Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and today I am bringing you a Cards video. Something I have not done in quite a while. Cards has been a game that I have always enjoyed, and I actually started this channel to make content for it. However, when I made that channel, Cards was essentially going through a content drought where there were no new expansions, balance patches were small and mostly just trying to fix the meta. There wasn't a lot of exciting stuff going on, and I eventually just kind of moved on. However, Cards in the last year and a little bit longer has essentially gotten into a regular content schedule with a new expansion every 6 months, frequent balance changes. The game has just overall gotten a lot more lively, and I want to get back into making content for the game. So for today, how about we talk about the July 2024 balance patch that has just been announced. Now, I will say I did help test and give feedback on these balance changes before they have been published, so I want to just simply give my own thoughts on it and where my headspace was when giving feedback and what got changed and why. Before we do that, though, we do need to talk about Covert Operations itself, a new expansion that has definitely caused quite a big meta impact, as a variety of new decks have come around, on top of many old decks having to significantly reinvent themselves to include many new cards. A quick look at the OCC from June shows that, in general, there are 3 main decks that people were taking and are generally considered the best. German-US mid-range decks based around Blitz Doctrine, Brit Air, and a Japan aggro deck mostly centered around the self-credit denial package. There are, of course, many other variants of these decks, but these are the 3 main ones that people were taking, and performance-wise, they are the strongest decks in the game. They are essentially the big 3 that needed to be addressed. However, not on this list is one more deck, which is the US Retribution. That deck itself is not exactly the strongest deck in terms of pure win rate, but instead it is getting some changes because it is a highly polarized deck that sort of just, it really wins in some matchups and then it hard loses to others, and it provides a problematic influence on the meta and also is something that has a lot of frustration from the player base, so that will also be getting changes. The end result is that this patch is essentially doing about 2 nerfs to each of the big 3 decks, aiming to slow these decks down and weaken their early game power or make their late game value slower and a bit harder to utilize when going into other aggressive decks. The hope here is that generally the metagame will slow down by a couple turns and allow a lot of decks that have kind of been pushed out that aren't as fast to come around again. Whether this is control, other options for mid-range decks, or a variety of other things. Let's start by talking about Brit Air. Brit Air was one of the boogeymen that kind of returned in the game, and this was largely due to a small handful of cards. Some of them were new cards, like the Shark being a powerhouse 2-drop, but there were also others, such as the US having more efficient buffs, alongside a couple other tools from them. In the patch, the main card specifically targeting British Air is the Shark, which more or less is getting changed to not count itself when dealing damage. This results in it dealing 1 less damage overall, and is going to have a notable effect of making the Shark a lot worse on less developed boards. More or less, if you play this on its own with no other bombers, it's not going to deal any damage, which is a notable nerf. There were other nerfs that were possible. For example, it could have maybe gone up in cost or whatnot, but the big thing, in my opinion, that Shark had become a problem with was that it just was too good at tempo. If you even had one or two other bombers out, this could come down and reliably kill most early game cards, which just provided such a powerful snowball effect. Now, the Shark is a lot closer to something like the Albacore, where it's gonna be good at, dealing one or two damage maybe, but it's not able to like as consistently wipe away enemy units. And this should help to make Brit Air a little bit weaker when it falls behind on the board. They'll have less tools to either push ahead tempo-wise early in the game with it, and if they're behind, they'll have a little bit of harder time making the Shark be like a really strong comeback tool. However, there is one other change that is specifically targeting Brit Air, and that is the Bomber Mafia change. Bomber Mafia is a larger change overall. Notably, it's hitting multiple of the top decks, notably the German US mid-range decks as well. But essentially, Bomber Mafia was designed and intended to be a ramp tool. It was meant to be a strong ramp card that, gave you some big bomber to play out, but also, if you had ramped up in the game, served as a mid-game board clear to help keep the pressure down. However, Mafia ended up just being a bit too strong for a couple reasons. First off, it turned out that it's not that hard to reach 8 credits, and the tempo that was provided by a 2 credit deal 2 damage was fairly strong. And on top of that, the ability to hit the enemy HQ meant that it actually had a little bit of burn potential, which further helped aggressive decks justify it, because late game you can use it to mess with the enemy board, develop maybe some big blitz bomber, and also get a little extra damage in with the effect. This has pretty much been the nerfs overall, as Bomber Mafia has been dragged up a credit cost while also losing the ability to hit HQs. This should still be a fairly strong ramp card, as you do need to reach 9 credits to utilize it, but ramp should have no issues with that, and 3 credits to deal 2 damage to all enemy units should still be fairly powerful. However, for a lot of more aggressive decks, this should be a lot weaker, because it's simply not going to be able to as efficiently be utilized, and it's just slower overall and doesn't have that burn capability anymore, making it a much slower and much more value-based option rather than something that like literally any deck could include. It hopefully will not be as prevalent as it has been. Then let's move on to maybe the biggest meta boogeyman currently in the game at the moment, and that is the Blitz Doctrine mid-range deck. Now, Blitz Doctrine was a card that potentially offers a very new effect into the game, which was a HQ buff that allowed you to enhance all your tanks. It was a very interesting card and potentially revitalized German tanks again, which was something that we haven't seen in like proliferation in quite a while. Of course, there has always been like aggressive German decks. Heinz has been a thing before, but Condensed Doctrine almost kind of incentivized a more mid-range style and was an interesting proposition. However, it did come out just generally a bit too cheap. It was a bit too easy to play Blitz Doctrine on 1, then something on turn 2, including even War Machines, I should note, before leading to Contest Doctrine on 3, and then snowballing from having such a strong board advantage. And essentially, the main change that is coming down to Blitz Doctrine is just making it slower. This includes a 1 credit nerf to Blitz Doctrine itself, but also a credit nerf to Contest Doctrine. This should significantly mess with the curve of decks trying to utilize this card. 2 credit to essentially develop a 3-cost German tank is not exactly going to be the strongest thing out there, and especially spending 4 credits will make it so Doctrine is hopefully a lot slower overall. 6 credits is quite the investment, and although there are cards like Famed Retreat that definitely do show that these effects are still powerful, hopefully it is a little bit slower and especially without like significant card draw, German tanks can hopefully be a bit slower paced, and it's a card that is more useful against slower decks who will have more time to respond to it, while also having faster decks be able to get underneath it. It should hopefully be just harder to utilize in those aggro matchups, which makes it worse overall. On top of that, there is another nerf that is coming to the deck, and that is 20th Panzer Grenadier. 20th has been an extremely powerful card for a long time, pretty much since it's been released. It did receive a nerf of becoming a 3/3, but remained at 4 credits. However, even there, it has remained a very, very strong and very common effect. So this is more or less a heavier-handed nerf that is still intended to keep it as a powerful and well-rounded card. Moving it up to 5 credits, but it's back to its old stat line of 3/4, means that in general, you're going to have a harder time using this as a positive tempo tool. The body has never been exactly great, but as a 4-drop, a 3/3 Blitz has been serviceable. However, by moving it to 5 credits, this not only means you have to wait one more turn to play it and use the Blitz, but that's kind of where like a 3/4 body is like seriously starting to become not that relevant. It's of course never irrelevant because it's a body, but you're not going to get like as much tempo out of it because that there are just bigger units that are coming out or buffs have come down, and in general it's just going to be a little bit harder to utilize this in an aggressive manner. It's hopefully going to move it a lot more into that mid-range value place that makes it just a little bit more fair, and combined with the nerfs to Bomber Mafia and Blitz Doctrine, hopefully the whole German US mid-range packages can slow down a couple turns and will just be easier to handle, either by going under them with more aggressive decks or by having enough defensive tools with enough time to outlast them. Then the final deck we're going to talk about is Self-Credit Denial, the last of the big 3. This was probably the weakest of the 3 decks, and as such has received a couple changes that are intended to round down some of its more egregious elements, but the core of the deck remains largely unchanged. Notably, we're talking about 5th Regiment, where this is now getting less of a buff while on the board. As the dev blog states, essentially early 5th regiments could lead to complete blowouts, as when it came down, if it got +2/+2 every credit you lost, it essentially snowballed to a point that it could not be removed by almost anything, and was overall just a bit too high-rolly for the health of the game. But make it only gain +1/+1, it can still be a very aggressive tool, but it is now not a overall, like, you need to kill this in one turn or it literally is going to become unkillable, which should make it a lot easier to keep under control, while hopefully still allowing it to be an efficient threat for that self-credit denial package. On top of that, we also have the Great Expanse. Now, the Great Expanse was an interesting one because, simply put, a credit nerf does not do much to how the Great Expanse is used, as it is usually being played on the turns you play one roof, where you just have like 1,000,000 credits to spend. So bumping this up to like 5 credits or even like 6 or 7 credits largely isn't going to impact the Great Expanse in any way. So there needed to be like a look at what is causing issues with the Great Expanse. And more or less, the Great Expanse, when it got played, was producing boards that were way too beefy in order to be dealt with. Not only were people generally dealing a ton of damage with it, but it then left behind a board that, if the enemy wasn't dead, they needed to deal with like a bunch of 8/8s immediately. It was just a bit too much for the card. And as such, the Great Expanse lost the ability to buff defense. This should keep the Great Expanse largely the same if you're using it to kill people, allowing for, like, lethals with like a lot of blitz units and whatnot. But if you can't finish them off with it, then the board that you leave behind is going to largely be made up of a lot more reasonably statted units. They're going to hit very hard, but they're not going to be unkillable either, and removal will be able to hopefully affect them. It should drag the self-credit denial deck down a bit. Leaving the Japan package and One Roof untouched leaves a lot of potential in the package, but these two changes are hopefully going to remove that high roll and then also make its finisher a little bit more reasonable overall. And then, as talked about earlier, the one deck that is being nerfed that is not like a top meta deck was Retribution. Retribution, as I said earlier, was a deck that is just not very like healthy for the game, as it's very polarized. Essentially, if you played a deck that was kind of slow, like if you played any control deck, Retribution would just literally win against you. There's nothing you could do to beat them. But if you were playing against aggro, Retribution decks were generally so slow, so clunky, and so like just like unable to defend themselves that they just kind of died. It's made the deck not very good, but polarized. So these nerfs are essentially looking to nerf the most polarizing elements, which was the combination of Yank combined with the developed 2 Retributions that was available. More or less, it's just going to make this specific part of Retribution a lot slower and a lot less viable if you want to try to go infinite with it. It's still possible, just a lot slower. Yank itself is getting a small change of only being able to trigger once per turn, which is overall, I think, not that big a change if you're playing normal Retribution. It's not hard to like only develop one time a turn, because you're only generating a couple Retributions through Outrages in a more normal match. So Yang should probably still see play in a Retribution package, especially in something like Ramp, where you're not trying to go literally infinite. The bigger change to this whole thing is that the developed 2 Retributions is going to from 4 to 6, which moves it into a significantly more expensive and credit expensive package. You're just not going to be able to do this constantly, because even Ramp, which has a lot of leftover credits, is going to be spending close to probably half of their overall credits, or like a third of it at least, in just developing that one card. That is a pretty significant investment, and it makes this Retribution thing a lot slower, combined with the fact that you're not printing as many Retributions through this, and it will drag, hopefully, this element down into a more reasonable position where Retribution is not such a free win. It's still probably going to be very strong, but it's hopefully going to be slow enough that other decks can reasonably like pressure it or provide some counterplay and actually fight against it. But that is a lot of nerfs. How about we talk about the handful of buffs that are coming along with this patch? Overall, this patch only has a couple buffs, and they're on the smaller side, but they're hopefully here to nudge a couple different things. Starting off, we have Night Raid. Night Raid is a order that was the OG Commando support card. It was the only way in the base game, outside of number 10 Commando itself, to get more Commandos. However, it's been a pretty bad card for years now. Like, essentially, it got dropped even out of Commandos, like, early on into the game. So, getting this down to 4 credits is just a nice little bump to it. Overall, maybe some Commando decks will run it if they really want to lean super hard on it. It's not going to shake up the world, but Commandos could use a bit of love, as this was a big thing for British in this expansion. And more ways to generate Commandos can always be appreciated thanks to cards like Infiltrate now. On top of that, we also have things like the T-35. The T-35 is probably one of the biggest buffs for Soviets, which a lot of people have been asking for, like, heavy Soviet buffs. However, I will personally say that I don't think the Soviets actually need that many buffs. the various nerfs to the top meta decks is going to slow the metagame down, and the Soviets have already popped up here and there. If we quickly jump back to the OCC list, you can even see there are a handful of people that were bringing Soviet decks. With more room to have like some time to develop and not having to deal with such incredibly powerful tools, I think the Soviets have a decent chance of expanding and kind of reaching a place where if they're not the top of the meta, which I don't think is likely, they at least can remain a relevant and capable nation that has a deck or two here that you can do well with. The T-35 in that instance is going to be a big supporting element. This essentially should make the T-35 a very solid self-damage tool. It's going to instantly proc 34th guards, 456 rifles. It's just overall going to fit very nicely into the deck as a solid 2-drop that slowly feeds into your overall goal. It also does have the benefit of always guaranteeing at least some damage on the enemy HQ. So if the enemy does get into like life or death mode on like a couple points of health, the T-35 becomes a must-kill threat, which isn't a major thing, but it is kind of fun to play it out even late game, and they might die to it. And the other Soviet nerf is the 60th Cavalry. 60th Cavalry has been a card that is potentially very powerful, but also is like just the stat line never really worked in its favor. 4 credits for a infantry that did nothing the turn you played it was too slow for more aggressive decks. Yet control decks essentially could not utilize it either because it happened to be in range of like literally all the removal in the game. Hammer, amphibious assault, and just like now commit the reserves and various numerous other options all pretty much killed 60th in one go. So there was pretty much 2 options. We could either have seen it grow bigger, such as making it like a 3/7, or maybe playing around with like a credit increase and making it like a 5 credit, like 4/7 with ambush or something like that. There were ways, but generally this card is maybe a bit better tuned to be an aggressive card. And to help with like the various buffs to like the Soviet T-35 and self-damage, 60th is getting changed to be a 2-drop, which makes it arguably a lot weaker in terms of like sticking around. But it's notable because as a 2-credit 2/4, it is surprisingly annoying to deal with in those early turns. Simply put, a 2/4 is just big enough that a lot of early units and many cheaper orders and deployment effects are unable to kill it efficiently, which leaves it to where 60th could be a very annoying card for people to run into. Think of something like the PE-2FT, a Soviet bomber that kind of does the same thing of grinding and kind of stopping people from playing their early cards in the ways they want to. 60th isn't a bomber, of course, and doesn't just completely stop orders, but it still can make certain decks that rely on playing a bunch of orders kind of squirm because they might have to like literally spend their turn dealing damage to 60th and then wait a whole turn before they can finish it off and play their other orders. It's not the most massive change, but I think it will make 60th a very interesting card for Soviet decks that lean a bit more aggressively. And maybe it's even good enough that it just kind of worms its way into a decent variety of Soviet decks. And then the final change is La Decima. La Decima has been a very strong card in the past. It was one of the defining cards of Italian control. However, time has been a bit unfavorable to it. Notably, naval engagement just kinda pushed it out of relevance because the 2/4 guard was never really that powerful, and naval engagement is just better by blowing up the entire backline. So, La Decima is getting kind of a double buff. It's not only going down a credit cost, but it's also getting 1 additional health. This makes it just ever so slightly better because a 2/5 is just big enough that a lot of mid-range threats are unable to kill it in one attack, while also making it, one, cheaper, making it a bit more stand out in comparison to naval engagement. I don't know if Italian control is really going to come around again. Maybe it does because the metagame slows down and people like what Italy is offering. But this is definitely a very nice buff, and Decima is definitely going to be a strong option in Italy control whenever it does come around. With all that said, that is the entire patch. Overall, I think that the patch will have a very positive effect on the metagame. Overall, I think a lot of the top decks are going to be dragged down a bit, and the pressures that are exerted on the entire metagame are going to relax, which will hopefully allow for things like Soviet decks and control decks and other things that have been struggling to really stand out will have more room to work with. They'll be able to better respond to what top decks are doing, and maybe can even carve out a significant meta presence themselves. Otherwise, that is all I have for today's video. If you liked it, make sure to like and subscribe for hopefully more cards content in the future. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this balance patch. I'm always curious to hear what other people think and if they like it or not. And otherwise, if you've watched all the way to the end of this, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.